Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. So we just had another session on stage one about this very topic. So I'm assuming, maybe by now, you've heard of the chant, "Women, Life, Freedom." How many of you have heard this phrase here? Hands up. Amazing. So it's a Kurdish phrase. Originally, in its Kurdish form, it was Jin, Jiyan, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. And this phrase has been part of the language of Kurdish women's resistance and the fight for freedom, now the fight for freedom in Iran. And so the first time this chant was said was on Saturday, September 17, in the city of Saqqez, Kurdistan. This is where the funeral for Mahsa Jina Amini was held. A few days prior, she was arrested by the Islamic Republic so-called morality police for showing a bit of hair. She was beaten while in custody, and a few days later, on Friday, she lost her life. And so a movement started, a movement that took on the language of her community in Saqqez, Kurdistan, Women, Life, Freedom. And I'm here to talk about technology, but of course, there's no real importance to technology without thinking about the people and the human cost of what has been happening in Iran. And I just wanted to start this off by, chanting women, life, freedom, and cutting off a piece of my hair for all of the women, youth of Iran who've lost their lives these past few months. And so, we're 9 months in from what happened, from the death of Mahsa Jina Amini, and this has turned into a historic women-led revolution. And unfortunately, over 500 protesters that we know of have been killed by the Islamic Republic's authorities. At least 58 of them were children, and at least 8 protesters that we know of have been executed by the Islamic Republic after they were arrested. And of course, this doesn't count the over 19,000 that were arrested, the thousands that were tortured, shot on the streets, lost their eyes. The costs of what has happened have been countless. And why is this important to be talking about in Berlin right now, 9 months after the beginning of this movement? Berlin has actually been a very important and historic place for this movement. On October 22nd, one of the biggest protest rallies for Iranians, for Iranian freedom, for women, life, freedom was held right here in Berlin. Over 100,000 Iranians in the diaspora, allies gathered to let Iranians know who were on the streets sacrificing their life, their blood for a future where the Islamic Republic was not taking away their rights, their future prosperity, everything. And so 100,000 people assembled here in Berlin. It became a very important site. Many civil society activists assembled here in Berlin to ask the German government to act in solidarity with Iranians. And in fact, Germany was one of the few Western countries that have taken one of the most intense steps. They announced that they were changing their foreign policy towards the Islamic Republic of Iran because of the human rights violations, because of what the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran has claimed can be said to be crimes against humanity inflicted by the Islamic Republic. And so the German government also co-sponsored a special session at the Human Rights Council in Geneva at the United Nations to help create a fact-finding mission to look into these crimes against humanity. And so Berlin in Germany has been a very important city for this movement, and hopefully it continues on having this role going forward. And so why exactly am I here? Well, for the past 9 months, I have been doing a lot of reactive work in regards to what has been happening in Iran. And so, as Julia was kind enough to say, I have been working in the field of digital rights, specifically Iran, for over a decade now. But what does this mean when people are on the streets, risking their lives, potentially being killed every day? Well, I've been really devastated by the brutality of what I've been seeing, but there has been so much hope. And I've been humbled every day to see my fellow Iranians inside of Iran sacrificing so much. One protester told me from on the ground, we have no fear, and we are here until the end, until the Islamic Republic falls, and until there is justice, but most importantly, until there is freedom. And so what I've been doing is looking at how technology can empower and not hinder these protests in Iran. Some of the things that we have been doing, myself and my colleagues and networks of other civil society organizations, such as Frontline Defenders or Access Now, has been spending a lot of time figuring out crisis response in terms of the online presence of a lot of protesters. And so what's really interesting about what's going on in Iran is that this is a women-led revolution, but it's also very much characterized by Gen Z, this generation of very youthful, fearless kids, teenagers, young adults who have been leading these protests. And what this has also meant is that this generation is extremely online. And one of the humbling elements of seeing what's been going on is to see for how long this generation has been fearless. There's so much repression and so much control over information. Yet these kids have been expressing their dissent and their hopes for a future Iran where, the economy is not held in the corruption of the Islamic Republic, and there are civil and political rights for everyone. And so, I really encourage all of you to go look at some of the digital footprint these kids have left behind. You can see the TikToks of 22-year-old Hadith Najafi. She was killed on the streets of Karaj earlier in October. Her TikToks are filled with her dancing to pop songs and showing just generally hopeful, youthful disposition. There's also 16-year-old Nika Shakarami's Instagram page. It's full of her happy young life, doing karaoke, singing along to Taylor Swift. And heartbreakingly, there's 16-year-old Sarina Ismailzadeh's blogs on YouTube. She talks about freedom and her hopes and philosophies on life and what a future of azadi for her generation would look like. All these young women, unfortunately, have been some of those that we have lost. What we have been doing in our organizations while dealing with some of these mass arrests has been trying to work with tech companies to ensure there's ways to protect and secure these digital footprints when protesters are arrested. So there have been some mass movements in universities where students have had mini uprisings, and the regime hasn't hesitated to crack down with brute force, arresting kids en masse. And so we often get contacted by families and friends of different kids asking us to help secure their accounts. For example, when a queer university student is arrested, not only can he be criminalized for the acts of protest and dissent, he can also be criminalized for the traces of his identity, queer identity, which is heavily criminalized in Iran. And so the role of civil society activists throughout what we say this crisis of arrests has been trying to work with tech companies to ensure that they have the right resources and human rights teams to be able to help facilitate with these issues. In conversations with Meta hosts one of the most used platforms inside of Iran, Instagram. Before it was censored back in October, Instagram was one of the most used social media applications in Iran, still is one of the most used social media applications. And Meta themselves have said that there hasn't really been any other crises where they've had to put so much resources and time to help support users as they have seen during the last 9 months in Iran, which is to say, how extremely online this situation and this movement has been. And so when looking at what is needed from tech companies, the need for these resources has been most apparent with one platform in particular, which is Twitter. While Twitter might not have as big of a user base as Instagram or Telegram, it's been very crucial in terms of getting news and media about the protests out. And so myself and various other human rights defenders and advocates saw in real time how the kind of change in ownership at Twitter, which was occurring simultaneously as the height of protests in Iran happened, how very much this was impacting human rights. So in conversations with Twitter employees, you could see every day at the end of October as Elon Musk was taking over Twitter and firing teams, the human rights team being one of the very first, you could see in real time how staff were dropping off and the support for this kind of crisis was diminishing every day, to the point that there really isn't any point of contact for civil society and human rights activists to work with Twitter. And so there were many issues that we were seeing related to how the regime was using their state media and various different influencers on that platform to promote things like forced confessions under torture. And so as we were trying to figure out how Twitter could respond to this, we basically lost any kind of ally inside of the platform. Until this day, Twitter doesn't really have a strong policy dealing with things like forced confessions and state media that is involved in human rights abuses and torture. Flooding the information space has also been another tactic that the regime has been using to kind of stop mobilizations from occurring. And one of the popular form of protest that we have seen as the kind of ebb and flow of protests and uprising since September have changed, which is because of these mass arrests, a lot of protesters have been mobilizing outside of prisons in Iran to try to stop torture or executions of various prisoners. And so in January, at the height of protests in front of one particular prison in Karaj, every day protesters were going out to stop the executions of 2 men, Mohammad Mehdi Karami and Mohammad Hosseini. In the midst of these mobilizations and these attempts to get the international community to put pressure on the regime, to get the regime to not go ahead with the dawn executions, the social media space was flooded with disinformation, which was, at the very height of these protests, a rumor was started by an influential Twitter account with over 100,000 followers. The account had built a reputation for being an opposition activist fighting for the end of the regime from inside of Iran, anonymously, of course. And so this account, which had built a reputation, started a rumor that one of the most famous judges in Iran, known as the hanging judge, Judge Salavati, had been assassinated by a protester. And so for a couple days, the Iranian information space got consumed by this rumor. As the populace was distracted, there weren't a lot of mobilizations for these protesters who were on death row. And of course, in the midst of that, the regime quietly went ahead and executed those 2 young men. And so this is one of the very examples of how technology and platforms can be misused for the purposes of the regime. And in this case, Twitter was used to infect the information space to distract protesters from mobilizing and to stopping these executions. Of course, this Twitter account, it was suspended initially, but under the regime of Elon Musk, no accounts are really left suspended, so it is back online and still continuing on with its different information campaigns. One other means of flooding that we have seen has been different campaigns by the regime to hack different leading voices in the opposition. Over the past few months, there has been a kind of coalition of different leaders in the diaspora that have come together to try to unite opposition against the regime. What we have seen was one particular hacking group that I was able to, through research, see was actually attributed to the regime's revolutionary guards, had been spending the past 5 years hacking into the accounts of these various notable opposition figures: Masih Alinejad, Nazanin Bonyadi, Reza Pahlavi, the former crown prince of Iran, who have been very active recently. And so over the past few years, they had gotten access at some point to their accounts, very temporarily, and gotten random bits of information from them. Of course, they had later secured their accounts. And so this hacking group, posed as Adla Ali, started using Telegram to put out this various private, criminally obtained content to, again, distract the diaspora. A picture of someone's wife hanging out with another man to try to say that this person is a cuckold, for example, or a personal video. One of the activists had sent her brother where she looked kind of goofy to try to paint the person as mentally unstable. Various things like this. And of course, what platform did this content originate on? It originated on Telegram, which unfortunately has turned out to be one of the safe spaces where regime propaganda really thrives. And there really hasn't been any kind of space for this platform to work with civil society or human rights defenders. And I'm sure it's not the same case. It's not only Iran. Telegram plays this function almost in, I think, every kind of community where hate speech and harmful content exists. Of course, beyond speech and types of content online, one of the big issues in Iran has been censorship and surveillance. And while independent journalism and any kind of reporting from inside of Iran is heavily controlled and restricted, it's very important for citizen journalists to be able to document what's happening. So anything we know about death tolls, and the kinds of crimes that the regime has been committing, and just the very nature of the mobilization and protests is because of the internet. And so the regime has been trying to develop new techniques to control the internet with much more sophistication. During November 2019, over 1,500 protesters were killed during that uprising. And of course, the regime ended up cutting off the internet for over 6 days. And so they wanted more sophisticated measures, and one of the leading techniques that they've been using has been trying to find sophisticated ways to disable VPNs using deep packet inspection. And so the regime has been staying way ahead of circumvention technology. And so there is a deep need by different tech companies to invest in this kind of area. And lastly, I wanted to touch on the issues of surveillance that have been noted in Iran. One of the kind of trendy topics that have come about has been the use of AI and facial recognition to police women and their bodies. And so, of course, one of the leading issues surrounding these protests has been saying no to mandatory hijab, women's rights. And there has been a lot of backlash against the so-called morality police who are responsible for murdering Mahsa Jina Amini. And so the regime has kind of said that they're working towards disabling the morality police and enacting sophisticated technology to police women. And so there has been a lot of discussions about the use of AI to do this. There isn't concrete documentation on exactly what technology is being used by Iran. And there have been some concerns that China is also sending this technology over. But when you speak to a lot of women inside Iran, they say when they are being policed for hijab, it's usually through, their workplace or buildings, and the technology might just be more hype in terms of the regime trying to create fear, which has been heavily broken down since September in terms of people fearlessly standing up against the regime, which has been a big loss in terms of losing obedience. And so there is a worry, obviously, about the development of facial recognition, but so far it seems more hype and publicity to generate fear to put women back. That is all to say, there needs to be a serious conversation of what needs to be done to empower Iranians with technology. And so as we're going through this economic global crisis and tech companies are reducing their resources, there needs to be a lot of talk and, I guess, efforts by different governments and states to ensure that tech companies maintain resources to support their most vulnerable users, from Meta to Twitter to Telegram, etc. Some work has been done. I mean, WhatsApp released a proxy feature back in January in reaction to the need for Iranians, but much more work needs to be done, especially in terms of providing better technologies for circumvention tools to Iranians. And so that is basically my short overview of the situation of the protests in Iran. Talking about technology might sometimes be a little bit, I guess, distance from the human implications of it, but for the past 9 months, we really have been living the implications of what speech online means and the lives it impacts. And that's not to say that technology will bring revolution to Iran, but it is an extremely important element in a situation where freedom of expression and information really has its own only refuge online. And so, thank you so much. Women, life, freedom.
Women, life, freedom. Thank you very much, Marsha, for this really breathtaking insights of your work and the hard life of the people of Iran and to fight this revolution. So I think you might have several questions to Marsha. So please use the chance and take one of the microphones on your left and your right. So who's the first? If nobody takes the chance as a, yeah.
Yeah, hello, thank you for your talk. In last autumn, there was one possibility which was broadcast through all media to support activists actively from Europe to install the Snowflake browser extension, which makes it able for activists in Iran to access the internet through the Tor network. Is that still something people in Europe and the rest of the world can do to support activists? Is it still something important?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people mobilize to create different Tor bridges to make use of the opportunities that Tor presents. Of course, Tor provides a lot of benefits and some hindrances. Not everyone amongst the general population has enough tech savvy often to use it, but there has been a lot of effort to make Tor more usable and all the different functions more usable. And yes, I mean, I mentioned that one of the biggest issues right now with the internet in Iran is how the regime is disabling VPNs. And so every day users are looking for new VPNs. And of course, Tor is one of many different tools that people rotate through. Yeah.
Another question from the audience. So if not, I have one. Yeah, similar to the first question. I really would like to know what I can do, or maybe also the audience can do, to support the women and people of the Iranians' revolution to win the situation and to take over.
Yeah, so I briefly went over the kind of hurdles there are for Iranians to get online, to express themselves, to document the human rights abuses. So I really encourage anyone, if you fall upon a video or any kind of content from inside of Iran. Again, we see different kinds of protest mobilizations. We were seeing earlier, a few days ago, in Abadan, every week Friday, in Zahedan and Sistan and Baluchistan, people are protesting. So if you do see this content come up on your timelines, don't scroll past it too fast. People had to go through multiple different hurdles in order to just get this content online and out there. So I would really encourage anyone to amplify the voices inside of Iran. And, someone mentioned Tor. A lot of these projects, they're open source. They're nonprofits that are supplying a lot of these free VPNs and tools. So, donating to Tor, donating to a lot of these other different internet freedom programs can also really help, especially to get people online.
Thank you very much. Any question? So I have another one. What can the digital economy do, part of giving money to Tor or other associations? What can the digital economy can do for the Iranians' revolution? So how can they support with technique and knowledge?
So you mean like cryptocurrency?
For example, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, cryptocurrency is very big in Iran. Of course, even before sanctions were placed in Russia, Iran had the biggest sanctions regime from Europe, from Iran. And so obviously it's very difficult getting money to support humanitarian causes, to support technologists creating circumvention tools inside of Iran. So digital economy plays a big role in terms of getting resources to the front lines. So there is a lot to be done there, and I'm not sure if this is related to your question on digital economy, but there is a lot of worry amongst activists that these big tech companies are going to stop investing their resources into supporting human rights, and so that is a big concern in ensuring that people and states keep pressure on them to continue this.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation and for all your work. You talked about the importance of Telegram for the disinformation of the Iranian regime, and I was wondering, because from what I've heard, and for example the protests in Hong Kong, it's also used by protesters to communicate. Is it still used in Iran for protesters, or are there other messaging tools, just like Signal or WhatsApp, I don't know, who are used mainly to communicate?
Yeah, so Telegram was censored in Iran in 2018. It was very big before that. It kind of was replaced by WhatsApp, and so WhatsApp has been the biggest communication tool in Iran, but Telegram is still very important. Unfortunately, in what we have seen in terms of crisis response and support from the companies, we generally don't encourage, protesters in such vulnerable environments to use Telegram, because if something happens, if their phone is confiscated, Telegram really isn't there to give a lot of support. I mean, they do sometimes react when we have kind of life and death requests, but it takes a long time. So generally, because of this lack of support and infrastructure, we discourage protesters in that context from using it. And so we have seen kind of a lot of uptick in users getting Signal, but of course there are some hurdles with using Signal as well, because the regime controls SMS texts. So creating a new Signal account can be very hard for some, because they can't get SMS verification with their Iranian numbers because the regime blocks that. And so this is kind of a space where we've been trying to work with Signal to update their features to help with this kind of population. Recently, they launched something that Article 19 had been working on, which is creating different avatars for Signal. So in case someone's phone gets confiscated, the authorities wouldn't find the Signal app right away because it would be camouflaged under a different kind of icon. And so there's a lot of work to be done with these companies to ensure they're designing their technologies for the most vulnerable.